Hello and welcome again. In the last segment, we talked about ways in which religion came to be associated with politics and especially with movements for independence in the period before the states of Southeast Europe became states. And now I want to talk about the period once they became states and what happened with religion. So why don't we begin with the first independent states that were formed in the region and the period before the Second World War. In those states, you saw a pattern in which, for the reasons that I described in the last segment, religion was very strongly associated with national identity everywhere. I say everywhere, but there's one important exception to this, and that is Albania. Albania has a very mixed population with very large communities that are Islamic, Catholic, and Orthodox. That is to say, that politically it would not have been feasible to associate statehood or national identity with a religion. And so Albania developed an approach to promotion of national identity that was explicitly non-religious. The slogan in Albania was "The religion of Albanians is Albanianism." So there was an invitation for people to identify themselves as being Albanian regardless of religion. This was not the case in other states that developed in the region. Generally speaking, these were all states which had a majority of a particular religion, and in which discrimination was practiced against people who were of different religions. In Yugoslavia, which was mixed, the Orthodox Church was favored. One of the things that this meant is that, especially for the larger religious minority communities, and here we're talking in particular about Catholics in Slovenia and Croatia, about Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo in particular, religion becomes an organizing site for politics in general. It's not a coincidence that religious figures played a major role in all of the national political parties in these places, but also religion became a site of so-called national resistance, that is, of movements for independence or autonomy on the part of minority groups during the pre-World War II period. In the post-World War II period, the period of state socialist governance, you had communist parties in power in the states in the region. Most of these parties were non-religious or anti-religious. That is, there was some measure of repression of religion. This tended to vary, the intensity of the repression and the seriousness of it over time. In Yugoslavia, there were really only two religious groups that were an object of sustained suppression. And those included Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for whom some forms of religious practice and observation, like the use of the veil of face coverings, were banned. And Franciscans in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, that is the Catholic order, which was suppressed because of the perception. Here's Stanislav to say hello. He's going to join our video presentation. That they were associated with the collaborationist movements in the Second World War. They were perceived as enemies of the state. But if you want to talk about extremes, Albania became the only officially atheist state in the world. That is, a state which banned religious practice and suppressed it actively. In Yugoslavia, after a few starts at suppressing religion, the approach generally became to try to integrate religious communities into the governance of state socialism, that is, to tame rather than suppress religion, so that religious practice was not banned. It was, in some cases, encouraged, and religious institutions were built and promoted on the condition that religious institutions be non-political and subordinate to the state. We can talk about the particular experience of some different religious communities during the period of statehood. First of all, if we want to talk about Islamic communities, um, now I said that there was discrimination on the basis of religion in pre-World War II Yugoslavia, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. They did an interesting thing with religion, however, and that is that they attempted to subordinate nationality to religion, so that, for example, religious instruction was a part of school curricula in the kingdom, and religious instruction was provided to Muslim students of Albanian ethnicity in Kosovo. However, what they did was they brought religious instructors from Bosnia and Herzegovina, so another place where there was predominant Muslim population, to provide this religious instruction in Serbo-Croatian rather than in the Albanian language. So the approach of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was to say we don't mind people being different religions, but they wanted them to participate in the nationality through things like language. When you move into the socialist period, now we've already said, in some ways, different parts of Islamic religious practice were suppressed during the communist period, including things like the wearing of veils. But it's also the case that the areas with the largest Islamic populations were the areas that were poorest and least developed at the beginning of this period, and that benefited the most from state investment and from development. So in many cases, it was people in the uh, um, the predominantly Muslim areas who benefited a lot more than other populations from the communist project of modernization, and became some of the people now with the fondest memories and warmest memories of Yugoslavia. In other places, religion functioned as a signifier of ethnic difference, in particular the ethnic Albanian population. The ethnic Albanian population is not entirely Muslim, but becomes a signifier of Muslim identity, in particular in Kosovo and in Macedonia. Now, in the 1990s, in the period when the state of Yugoslavia breaks apart and violence begins, the consequences of violence are dramatic. I think many people of Islamic faith in Bosnia and Herzegovina who had not previously been religious took a greater interest in religion, partly because they were conscious of the fact that they were targeted because of their religion, and their religion was targeted, partly because of the efforts of international Islamic organizations and some wealthier Muslim countries to provide assistance to them, and partly because of the transformative effect of support from Muslim countries with a unique religious tradition, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and so on, in promoting the rebuilding and building of religious sites, but conditioning that on these sites operating according to principles reflective of their traditions rather than the traditions local to Bosnia and Herzegovina. In the contemporary period, you also see religion being used throughout the region as a vehicle for the assertion and the re-expansion of Turkish interest, where the existence of a common religion is seen as a basis for building relationships, in particular in culture and in education. If you want to look at Catholic communities, in the period of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, also in the period of state socialism, there was a tendency of the church to function as a national institution, as a site for political meeting of people interested in independence, autonomy, some of them opposed to the existence of a federal state of Yugoslavia. This becomes more important in the 1980s, when anti-communist political activity becomes an important part of the global political activity of the Catholic Church, in particular after John Paul II, who was originally from Poland, had been his own type of dissident in Poland during the period of state socialism, becomes Pope. Now, what this means for the Church is that participation in the global anti-communist activity of the Catholic Church meshes with the national politics, and the church becomes a more important site of national resistance. And what this means is that after 1991, when Croatia becomes an independent state, for example, this being the largest state with a Catholic majority in the region, the church establishes itself as a powerful independent political force allied with the nationalist right wing in the country, so that, for example, when Croatia becomes a member of the European Union, one of the first major activities of religious organizations is to sponsor and promote a referendum to ban same-sex marriage in Croatia. And they chose this as the subject of the referendum, that is, as their opportunity to make a show of political force, after their polling showed them that a referendum to ban abortion would not succeed. If you want to look at Orthodox communities, during the period of state socialism, the National Orthodox Church operating outside of the country became a major site of political organization. And it was there that you saw extensive activity on the part of what I guess you could call political priests. Many of them were people associated with the movement, the so-called Chetnik movement, that had been defeated by the partisans in the Second World War. But if you go into diaspora communities outside of the territory of, in particular, the former Yugoslavia, you would often find that there was not one Orthodox church, but two. There was one that was aligned with the official Orthodox Church organization in the country that was loyal to the state, and there was one that was aligned with the group that was opposed to the state. And these existed in a kind of uneasy detente with one another. At the end of the communist period, the Orthodox Church becomes very closely associated with the revival and promotion of nationalism. And as the territory of Yugoslavia divides into an increasing number of states, you see conflict over the establishment of relatively new national churches, so that the Serbian Orthodox Church fights for control against relatively newly established national churches in places like Montenegro and in Macedonia. You also see the church asserting its political power, spreading its influence into traditional fields, the commemoration of holidays, the expansion of holidays based on holidays in the church calendar, as well as non-traditional fields, so that you see representatives of religious organizations as members of institutional bodies, the body for the regulation of media, for example. PolsocSEE too, in the contemporary period, becomes a kind of point of contact for the development of a form of politics that is opposed to alignment with Europe and the so-called West, and as a point that is raised, just like the commonality of Islamic faith with Turkey, as a point of commonality with Russia and a way of expressing a kind of fundamental unity and brotherhood with Russia. This association of religion with national identity takes on a particularly virulent form during the 1990s, during the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia, in which you could see the dominant religious organizations standing very decisively behind national military and paramilitary movements, as illustrated by these two photos you see on the slide. One of them shows an Orthodox bishop, that is the Bishop Filaret, posing in front of a group of paramilitaries who are there holding their flag on a tank, holding a weapon, trying to embody the close association that many in the church wanted to promote between religious belief and support for the most extreme nationalist goals. In the other photo, you see the fellow raising his hand there. This is a convicted war criminal, Dario Korlic, who was released from prison after serving his sentence for severe war crimes that I won't describe to you now. This is the scene in which he returns after being released from prison, and among the people greeting him is another bishop, that is Vlado Kosic, a politically active archbishop who came to the airport to greet the war criminal and show that he was welcome. So a lot of the role role that you might expect in other communities for religious institutions to play in the promotion of mutual understanding and reconciliation was not played in the states that we're talking about, and instead you saw a very close alignment of the dominant parts of religious institutions with extreme political movements. But I want to leave you on a hopeful note and tell you that was not always the case. And so I will show you this monument. This is a monument in Čačak in Serbia. It was built in 1934 as a memorial to victims of the First World War, and it's popularly known as the Four Religions Monument. The monument is an obelisk with four sides, and you can see in the photo here, on one of the sides is the Catholic cross, on another side is the Jewish star of David. On the other two sides that you can't see, there is the Islamic crescent and the Orthodox cross. So this was a monument that was built in order to represent the fact that victims of the First World War were members of all of the faiths that had large populations in the city of Čačak. When it was built, the Orthodox Bishop of Čačak, who is a very controversial figure himself, Nikolai Velimirovich, who has recently been made a saint, a fact that is also controversial, said that he would excommunicate any priest who attended the dedication ceremony for the monument. But I do not believe that he got complete obedience from the priests of Čačak. In any case, this monument was built in 1934. In 1941, when Nazi Germany invades and conquers the territory of former Yugoslavia, including Serbia, they destroyed the monument, and it remained destroyed until the 2000s, when there was an initiative to rebuild it. So it has been rebuilt, it has been restored, and what you see in the first photo there on the slide are representatives of each of the major religious communities in Serbia. So there is the chief rabbi of the Jewish community, there is the chief imam of the Islamic community, the Catholic bishop, and the Orthodox bishop, all together at the rededication of the monument. What I want to say is, although the emphasis on religion in Southeast Europe is very often on conflict and division, this is not the only thing that there is, and there are many places where things like a common experience, a shared faith in superior power and commitment to morality is a basis for unity, and it might be, certainly in the current moment, a minority political approach, but it's one that exists and that I don't want to ignore. In any case, this is an overview of issues related to religion in the region, and I will look forward to discussing with you questions related to it when we have our live meeting this week.